Hello everyone, my name is Nisha Stevens and this is my week 2 assignment research case study presentation. Okay, so the first case I want to talk about is New York Times versus Sullivan. So who are the parties in this case and what facts led to their dispute? L.B. Sullivan is the respondent in this case, and the New York Times, aka the petitioner newspaper, is the defendant in this case. So why did Sullivan feel his reputation was damaged by the New York Times? According to Sullivan, he claimed that the allegations against the Montgomery Police Department defamed him personally. Sullivan was a Montgomery police officer at the time, and he claimed he was defamed by statements made in an advertisement by the petitioner. The ad included claims about his actions during civil rights demonstrations. Sullivan was also one of 3 people in charge of the Montgomery County Police Department at the time. Ultimately, he sued the New York Times, aka the petitioner newspaper, for libel, meaning they printed something knowing that it was false and that it could potentially cause harm. Even though the ad did not mention Sullivan's name, he claimed that the ad implied his responsibility for the actions of the police. He said that the ad overall damaged his reputation in the community. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what are the key elements of a defamation claim. According to our readings this week, when it comes to defamation, there are really 4 key points. Number 1 is a false statement purporting to be a fact. Number 2 is a publication or communication of that statement to a third person. Number 3 is fault amounting to, at the very least, negligence. And number 4 is damages. Basically, damages are any harm caused to a person or entity who is the subject of said statement. So then we get to talking about, because Sullivan was a public official, what did he actually have to prove in this particular case? I discovered that under Alabama law, Sullivan did not have to prove that he had been harmed in any way in this civil suit. So then we're going to talk about the Supreme Court's decision and why it made that decision. But first, I wanted to touch on the Alabama State Court decision. So in the end, Sullivan won his case in the Alabama court, and the New York Times was ordered to pay him $500,000 in damages. But when it comes to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, they actually ruled in favor of the New York Times. And I thought that was very interesting because when they did their advertisement, the New York Times actually put out inaccurate information or false information, which in my opinion highly discredited their case at that point. However, they were still able to win due to this issue of the First Amendment law that really played a big part in this case. So as we know, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech, and specific qualifications must be met in order for the claim of defamation or libel against someone to actually stick. So the reason why the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times was that they stated the newspaper had the right to publish all statements, regardless if they were false, because they are protected under the First Amendment. Okay, now we're going to talk about our second case, Gertz versus Welch. As to who the parties were in the case, it was Elmer Gertz, a attorney in the Chicago area, versus Welch Magazine. In this instance, Elmer Gertz was not considered a public figure. He was considered a private person. And basically this case was about Gertz, who was a reputable attorney in the area, was hired by the family of a murder victim to represent them in a civil litigation case against the murderer, a Chicago policeman, and basically the whole Chicago Police Department. Welch Magazine wrote an article that Gertz says defamed him and defamed his character. In the article, it was implied that Gertz had a criminal record, and he was also labeled as a communist fronter. So what was done to confirm the accuracy of these allegations against Gertz? It was my understanding that they underwent an actual malice test to see if quote-unquote actual malice occurred in this case. Only then could Gertz receive punitive damages in this case. And this is also a very interesting subject for me to dive into because, again, in our readings this week, it discusses that if the person defamed was a private person, in most states, that person making the defamatory statement can only be held liable under key circumstances. So if they knew the information was false and defamatory, then they can be held liable, or if they acted with reckless disregard for the truth or falsity of the information in making the statement, which in my opinion the publication did. And lastly, if they acted negligently in failing to ascertain whether the statement was true or false before making it. Again, that could also fall into this publication's actions in making the statements that they made. So since the publication defamed his character and basically suggested that he was not to be trusted, I feel like these statements could ultimately damage his reputation. That is answering the second question. How do I think these allegations affected his reputation? I think they could potentially damage his credibility as a lawyer. I mean, for all we know, he could have been forced to take a leave of absence from his law firm or from his job as a result of all of this because the comments were pretty negative, and that could affect his clients, that could affect his personal life, etc. As for what I would have done differently, I am really a firm believer in telling the truth, being very truthful in my journalistic practices. I would have made sure that everything I wrote was factual to the best of my ability, and to make sure that I had multiple sources or multiple sources of proof to back my claims up, because the last thing I want to do is be accused of defamation or libel and not have any proof to back up my claims. So that's what I would have done. Okay, as for the outcome of the case, in the first decision, Gertz won a jury verdict and an award of $50,000, but he still lost his libel suit because the judge found that the magazine had not actually violated the actual malice test for libel, which the Supreme Court had established in the previous case we discussed, New York Times versus Sullivan. So that leads into decision 2, where the Supreme Court also held that when private people sue for defamation, the states may decide which fault standard applies. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about my state's defamation law. I currently live in Maryland, and it was a bit tricky to find information on my state's exact defamation laws. I was able to track down some information from various websites and compare, and they pretty much said the same thing. Overall, Maryland recognizes the distinction between defamation per se and defamation per quo. And to state a claim of defamation under Maryland law, a plaintiff must allege 3 things. 1, that the defendant must make a defamatory statement to a third person. 2, the statement must be false. 3, the defendant was legally at fault in making the statement. And I apologize, the 4th one is that the plaintiff must have suffered harm. So that kind of falls in line with pretty much the other cases that we have read about so far and the other state laws that we have read. The definition of defamation has stayed pretty much consistent and the same in my state. And as for the last question about how I can relate what I've learned from the Sullivan and Gertz cases to my future work in communications and journalism, really what I've been saying throughout this entire course is that I truly believe in being transparent and open and honest as a journalist. So I'm constantly striving to always uphold the values of the profession and adhere to the standards set forth in the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. When I was in my undergrad, I was a part of the Society for Collegiate Journalists. I did multiple trainings on ethics and law and things of that nature, so I'm very aware of how important it is to report the news accurately and fairly. And I also recognize the role that journalism plays in society. I think in recent years there's been an increased focus on the responsibility of journalists to report ethically and with integrity. And as a result, I have become more aware of my own biases and how they can influence in my reporting. So I think I've also become more conscious of the need to verify information before sharing with the public. That's where I think a lot of these cases had their downfall, is that they did not fully verify and fact check their information, or they just went with it and decided to go ahead and publish it anyway, which is not always the greatest idea in my opinion. While the First Amendment does protect my rights to report the news, I also recognize that journalism is a privilege that comes with great responsibility. So in order to maintain the trust of the public, I think that it is essential that I continue to uphold the highest standards of journalistic ethics throughout my career.